Hi friends, my name's Chris, and this week we continue with book club with Kierkegaard's Either or. We'll be covering two chapters, the unhappiest one and crop rotations. We'll be talking a little bit about what it means to be the most unhappy person in the world and a little theory on how to be as happy as possible, according to author A. I hope you guys enjoy the discussion. And so that brings us kind of to chapter 5, where author A starts to contemplate what the unhappiest person in the world might look like. It's almost like a bit of a thought experiment that he's running. Thinking like, okay, well, can we think up of what this person, what the most depressed and sad person would look like? What would drive someone to kind of become the champion? And he kind of frames it in a way almost as if it's like the Olympics, or like a competition. Suggesting that like it's like one person can just become a little bit more unhappy than the next, and yeah, almost like I thought when I was reading it, I was thinking of like the Depression Olympics. And so he starts off with saying, well, obviously there are unhappy people in the world, but what brings a lot of people this unhappiness is the fact that they die. People are very afraid of death and become very unhappy at the ideas of death. But he says, no, it's definitely not he who dies who becomes the unhappiest. It's the one that continues living, the one that has to live forever. This is the person who will probably become the unhappiest. Why? Because you strip away one of the few certainties that we have in life. The certainty being, that we're mortal, we're going to die. And if you take that away from someone, then that would be the greatest misfortune. That would bring about a unease that could not be consoled. All men are fortunate enough to die. Author A is thinking here. And so, it's unlikely that we'll ever find the unhappiest man. He's almost like this elusive character that doesn't really exist. And so, he starts to kind of sketch out this hypothetical man that probably doesn't exist. And he thinks that one of the big drivers of unhappiness is the degree to which you are present in yourself, or present in time, let's say. He says at one point that the unhappy man is completely absent to himself, but he has his whole consciousness. And he thinks that man can be absent in many ways. And so we talked a lot about this concept I'll introduce in a second, in Augustine's Confessions. But I think Kierkegaard, or at least author A, is kind of echoing this. And so he sees man as this individual that's living in the present. And we have this ability to remember. We have memory. And in a way, we're almost reaching back into the past. We're extending ourselves temporally every time you remember and try and think about things in the past. At the same time, man has this capacity to hope for things in the future, think about things to come. And so in a way, we can almost temporally extend ourselves into the future in that way. So man is kind of living in the present, or the self is in the present, and we have this ability to reach back into the past through memory and into the future with hope. However, in doing these two things, you lose something. Whenever you remember, you're no longer present. You're absent. Whenever you hope, you're no longer present. You become absent. You become present in the future or present in the past. And every time you try and reach into the past through memory or hope for something in the future, author A thinks here, you are, in a way, let's say torturing yourself a tiny bit, or there is a really unsettling nature, unsettling thing that comes about when you do this. Whenever you reach into the past, when you reach into memories, when you become reflective, maybe this depression or nostalgia or these negative feelings will start to bubble up. And whenever you trying to hope for the future or look into the future, an anxiety bubbles up within us. And so here in the unhappiest one, I think what's going on is that Kierkegaard, or author A, is saying that perhaps the unhappiest person is one who is constantly either remembering or hoping for the future. And so he's not present to himself. But since he's able to reach into the future and reach into the past constantly, he's almost like, he calls him like the most conscious man. He's able to fully be aware of his consciousness in both memory and anticipation. And so he thinks happy people, or the happier people, people who are living in the present, living in the now, these people, while they may not have their entire consciousness available to them, they will be happier. And so he kind of starts to contrast here between two types of people that might exist: hoping individuals, people who are always anxious about the future, who are living between the present and the future, and remembering individuals, people who are always concerned with the past, memories, regret, and all that type of stuff. But the person at the number one spot of unhappiness will be he who can do both, he who can be incredibly depressed and incredibly anxious through this recollection and memory, and through this anticipation and hope. And that's essentially who he outlines, this hypothetical figure, the unhappiest one. That's who he's outlining in this chapter. And as we get into the seducer's diary, I think there's good arguments that could be made that maybe the seducer has achieved that level, or at least has gotten as close as humanly possible to that level. The next chapter, in crop rotation. This is a super interesting one, I thought. So I think the way to frame these three chapters is in saying that the unhappiest one, it's kind of like a psychological analysis of what constitutes unhappiness or consciousness. Crop rotation, it's a theory to avoid that. It's like a framework almost that we can like work through. And then we'll see in the seducer's diary that that's like a practical application of the theory in crop rotation. But crop rotation, it makes one claim at the beginning that like you can disagree or agree with, but the claim is essentially that boredom is the root of all evil. All bad things come from being bored, or boredom generally. And you can think about a lot of the anxieties we get, they come from being bored. A lot of the depressions we get, they come from being bored. We're always trying to constantly distract yourselves. And that's more, I guess, obvious or salient like in modern times than it's ever really been. And evil feeds off of this boredom, he thinks. It's this boredom that we need to be very, very careful of. He reads, or I'll just read like a short passage. What author A is saying here, he says, we can trace this from the very beginning of the world. The gods were bored, so they created man. Adam was bored because he was alone, so then God created Eve. From that time, boredom entered the world and grew in exact proportion to the growth of population. Adam was bored, then Adam and Eve were both bored together in union. And then Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel were bored as a family. Then the population increased and people were bored en masse. And so to divert themselves, and remember this concept of diversion that we talked a lot about in Pascal's Pensée, this divertissement. They divert themselves and they conceive the idea of building the tower, the big Tower of Babel. That idea, the very idea is as boring as the tower was high. Then the nations were scattered all across the earth, and people began to travel abroad, but they continued to be bored. And so we are just plagued with boredom as a species. And through boredom, all evil acts kind of grow. And he thinks that the modern man is doing a really, really bad job at trying to stave off this boredom. He says, well, now we don't even try and stave off boredom in the way we used to. And I guess he's looking at his 19th or 18th century society in Denmark. He's saying that we don't even stave off boredom, we are accelerating it. We hold these assemblies in parliament, we legislate long, boring bills, we attend meetings, we just do a ton of stuff that's like absolutely boring that we don't want to do all the time. What's more boring than that? And so, in ancient times, he thought, at least when there was kings and queens, the people in power were those who were most aesthetically pleasing. Those who were able, the sophists, those who were able to speak poetically, to dress nicely, to be good looking. But now it's come to the point where the people in power are those who are most boring, those who can collect the most votes, those who can attend the most meetings in parliament, who can pass the most bills, and that's just devastating. That's not the way we should go about things. I think he's so afraid of this boredom because it suggests, it's like proto-existentialism, it's suggesting that nothing is inherently worth doing. If boredom is the root of all evil, then maybe it's the case that nothing's inherently worth doing. And then he proposes the alternative view, or an alternative view that people have at the time as well. A lot of people don't think that it's boredom that's the evil or that's the wrong. Maybe it's idleness. It's not doing anything productive with your time. If I just sat here in my room all day and read or played video games, I would kind of be idling. Oh, and that's the root of evil. It's not exactly being bored about doing certain things. It's the idleness. He clearly thinks that they're wrong. They've misunderstood humanity or our psychology. So then he kind of sketches out a way to, two ways that we have for staving off boredom, or two ways we have to deal with boredom. An internal way of dealing with boredom, and then an external way of dealing with boredom. And obviously the chapter is called crop rotation, so I think the analogy here the analogy that he does use is in treating our boredom or our attention the same way maybe a farmer would treat his land. If you want to keep the soil fertile, you need to be planting different things constantly. And this is, he thinks, a very crude way, a very like simple or naive way of staving off boredom. It's like, okay, well, if you don't want to be bored, then just change the things that you are experiencing or that you're in contact with. An external form of like attention switching, let's say. So what you can do, he says, okay, if you want to stave off boredom, and we agree that boredom is the most evil thing ever, what we can do then is engage in activities like traveling. So you don't want to be bored? Okay, we'll just travel, go to France and look at the Eiffel Tower. If you don't want to be bored, if you finally get bored of looking at the Eiffel Tower, go to Rome and look at the Colosseum. Travel around. Are you bored of your lover? Change your lovers. Just, leave them, find someone else, and you'll become, and you'll get rid of boredom that way. Seek new environments, switch your job, take up a new pottery class. Just like constantly seek out new experiences that will stave off boredom. He thinks that this is a very, very silly, or like a very, very blunt, or like simple way of dealing with boredom, because, well, we know that the world is finite. You can't infinitely keep on traveling to new places. You're going to run out of places. And even if you don't run out of places to visit, you're going to start realizing that all of these places are kind of the same. Like, sure, the name of the city might be different, but every city has roads, every city has buildings. Sure, you might no longer, sure, you might be able to like date a new person or change your lovers, but if you keep doing that, you're going to start realizing that people are a lot more similar than you thought before. The same archetypes will play out over and over. You're going to realize at the end of the day that you're not going to stave off boredom completely just by changing lovers. Same thing with new environments. So he thinks that that's one simple way of staving off boredom, a naive way. He calls that the external method of crop rotation. If you don't want to be bored, instead of planting corn, plant tomatoes. Instead of planting tomatoes, plant potatoes. Silly, The actual way, I guess he thinks, that we should stave off boredom is a more internal and reflective way. And so he thinks that, well, we don't need to change the objects of our entertainment. What we can do is we can selectively attend to certain aspects of those entertainments. So for example, I don't know, I'm thinking like, let's say you're someone who enjoys watching movies. Um, in order to no longer become bored of watching movies, practice this selective attention. Sometimes focus on the soundtrack of the movie. Just kind of try and direct your attention toward the music and the scoring and all that type of stuff. But don't do that for too long because then you're going to get bored. Switch that. Then look at the visuals and pay attention to the visuals and the CGI or the cinematography. But don't do that for too long because you're going to get bored. Then move on to the actors and the expressions or the psychology or the story writing. The idea isn't to change the object that's being that's entertaining you or that's keeping you from being bored. The idea, or what we should do, is selectively attend to different aspects of that thing. And he says we can do that through either selective attention or reframing it, through cultivating certain moods over others, through distancing ourselves. And I think this is the most interesting one for me. He thinks that if we want to stave off boredom, the best thing we can do is to not fully immerse ourselves in the thing we are experiencing or engaging in. So if you're listening to a beautiful song, don't fully let yourself experience the beautiful song. Hold back a little bit. Create this distance between you and that experience. If you're with someone that you love or that you really enjoy being around, don't fully let yourself fall for them. Don't fully give yourself in. Because if you do so, then you might get bored. Keep a distance. And in giving yourself this distance between you and the entertaining thing, or whatever is staving off boredom, by doing that, then you can kind of have a little bit of control over it. You've gained back control. And so this is, I guess, his way of saying, okay, well, we've figured out a way of staving off boredom through this method, not of rotating the crops literally, but internally focusing on other things while keeping the objects that are external the same. However, a lot of people will criticize this and they think it's a bit paradoxical in a way. Because remember, this is where right now we are in the domain of the aesthetic man, of the aesthetic life. And what's important for the aesthetic man is to, find pleasure in things. It's to find beauty in things. And how can we find beauty or pleasure, at least maximally? How can we get the most bang for our buck if we're not letting ourselves fully become immersed in that thing? So on one hand, he's saying, okay, well, no, the important things in life is to completely, when you're listening to a song, just let it wash over you. Completely immerse yourself in it. But now all of a sudden in crop rotations, he's saying, okay, well, no, we don't want to get bored of that. So let's not fully immerse ourselves in it. So there seems to be a clear paradox here to me. And I guess a lot of scholars or academics, if you read commentary, they say that this chapter is kind of an ironic slash satire. It's like a satire, I think, because Kierkegaard, he wants to highlight the inherent issues and flaws with the aesthetic mode of life, because he's a religious man, and after we read the next section, which is the ethical, that's his jumping off point for the religious life and his whole religious framework. So I think here he's kind of maybe mocking, maybe not directly, but being very satirical with this method that we can deploy to avoid boredom. And maybe he's poking jabs at modern society, because this is what we seem to do. A lot of people seem to do this. They seem to bounce between lover to lover. They're constantly traveling, trying to see new places and have these new experiences. And this is kind of the way we go about staving off boredom. And that's crop rotations, essentially, or all I have to say for now about crop rotations. So I think we have the unhappiest one, which was a psychological explanation or like investigation as to what would make the most unhappy person, which led us to boredom being one of these things that like generates or at least like makes room for evil to grow. And if we want to stave that off, then we need kind of like methods. We can have internal methods and external methods, and he thinks that the internal methods are the better way to go to selectively attend to the things that are entertaining us. And so we have the theory down, and finally we made it to the Seducer's Diary. And so the Seducer's Diary, as I kind of, I guess, mentioned at the very beginning, it's this chapter that outlines a story of a man called Johannes, and his, I guess it's like a story almost of him trying to seduce a woman named Cordelia. And for any of you guys who were here like earlier on the book clubs when we were doing introduction and kind of like talking about Kierkegaard and who he was a really big fan of opera and play. And so this Seducer's Diary is kind of modeled off of Don Juan's play. The play that we discussed in Ancient Tragedies in the Modern, which was about a man who just went around seducing hundreds and hundreds of women across Europe and got himself into troubles. However, this figure, he was a very unreflective man. He was living constantly in the immediate, and wasn't thinking very, very much about himself or his place in the world. He wasn't a very existential person. And that script is kind of flipped here. Johannes, in the Seducer's Diary, he is an incredibly reflective man. And so his ultimate goal, I guess, is not to win favor over Cordelia, not to marry Cordelia, not to even fall in love with her, but to seduce her. He's treating his existence as a type of like masterpiece that he is puppeteering, or like he has these like manipulation strings and he's kind of just like playing it out. He's constructing something for himself, obviously at the expense of someone else. And yeah, so I feel like there's a lot more that can be said about the Seducer's Diary, and next book club will probably talk like quite a bit about it. But I think that's enough stuff to like leave on the table and maybe just discuss or probe about what it means to be unhappy, about whether or not death is a comfort, about if we are in modern society really similar to these like these crop rotation people that he's talking about, always trying to travel and like seek new experiences to stave off boredom. If boredom is the root of all evil, I guess I'll leave a lot of those questions on the table. Yeah, and kind of just wrap up there and stop talking and drink some water.